As noted previously, a big part of Star Wars' success is its sense of timelessness. Apart from one's ability to discern the recency of certain special effects techniques and then contemporary hairstyles, it feels like something that could have existed at any point in time, but especially after it became such an overwhelming presence in popular culture, something that somehow must have always existed. It's genuinely difficult to remember a time before Star Wars, or that there was a time before Star Wars, specifically in terms of its place within the shared cultural mythology. ILM and others did indeed invent and refine new techniques to create revolutionary visual effects of the original Star Wars. They didn't simply emerge from nowhere. Visual effects technology had evolved in sophistication along with every other technical aspect of Hollywood filmmaking. You can see it on display in the massive spectacles rendered for disaster films and historical epics in the 60s and 70s. It was just that no one wanted to spend that kind of money on fantastical sci-fi for the most part, because the audience was either thought to be children or undiscerning grindhouse filmgoers who didn't care about production value and weren't numerous enough to draw big sales or big stars. So the genre spent much of the mid-20th century divided paradoxically in half. Spectacle sci-fi generally got lower effects budgets despite having more effects sequences, while adult-skewing intellectual sci-fi got bigger budgets despite typically featuring fewer or more subtle uses of visual trickery. What Lucas ultimately accomplished with Star Wars was on the technical front unifying the two, bringing A-list budget and thus an A-tier release platform to justify the cost to what was seen as B-list material, which was really just a continuation of the general philosophy of his so-called film school generation of filmmakers, a philosophy grounded in the same genre film reappraisals of the cahiers de cinéma auteur theory movement. Auteur theory had many more nuanced permutations as it continued to evolve, and also plenty of well-argued pushbacks from the likes of Pauline Kael and others in its day, along with quite a bit of modern criticism as to, just for example, how cavalierly its implicitly macho idealism of the hyper-individualist singular author minimized the, in some respects, and by no means ideal, gender parity of the studio era versus the overwhelming whiteness and maleness of what came to be elevated as the auteur canon, all fair and relevant points. But for the purpose of our discussion here, auteur theory changed the study and popularity of filmmaking in much the same way that method and the rise of Brando and Dean had transformed film acting, and if you were paying close attention and connecting the dots in your head, you already know how this fits into the discussion. By the time auteur theory established itself as the official cool kid film school religion that bonded the Southern California clique that blew open and ultimately blew out the 70s into the blockbuster era, for many would-be directors it had been condensed down to a pair of ultra-potent bullet points. The director is omnipotent rock star, storyteller, art god, and trashy, weird B-movie stuff that you'd been big into as a kid and or geeky teenager actually had real artistic merit. Do you want George Lucas's? Because that's how you get George Lucas's.
That's how you get ants!
To wit, it's commonly stated as an article of common faith when explaining this very phenomenon that Star Wars success came out of nowhere, that 20th Century Fox thought they'd sunk money into another weird experimental piece from one of Francis Coppola's film school brat proteges, but that this one might make a little profit on the back end because sci-fi stuff was sometimes popular with children during daytime shows in certain months, and Alan Ladd Jr. and that Spielberg kid seemed to think it was worth something, so hey, why not? That 50s race car movie he did had done pretty good business.
Grab that special one and jump into your candy-colored custom or your screaming machine, cruise downtown and catch American Graffiti.
American Graffiti? Baby, what's that?
It's a movie.
Can you dig it? Can you dig it?
Go back in time.
Where were you in '62?
But then it comes out, and what the hell? People are lining up around the block. It's this huge deal. Apparently 100 or so different cultural factors, see previous sections, had all lined up like some kind of grand cosmic conjunction to create a scenario where this specific movie could fill dozens of desperate cultural, spiritual, mood-of-the-moment needs all at once that no one had managed to connect the dots on, not even Lucas, who was mostly just trying to get a story out of his system. No one, so goes the accepted version of events, saw this coming. In other words, Star Wars was a lucky break. The right movie at the right time. There was no possible way to know that a giant-scale fusion of science fiction, high fantasy, orientalist pop spiritualism, and aesthetically depoliticized heroic war story pitched squarely at the narrative sensibilities of hyper-imaginative, sci-fi-loving, action figure role-playing, comic book collecting, spaceship fantasizing 10-year-olds was the new blockbuster model the studio system had been looking for to replace what biblical epics, musical roadshows, and big star screwball comedies had been in the previous decades.
I sense something, a presence I've not felt since...
And even if some foresight-cursed Cassandra in Hollywood had figured it out, no one on Madison Avenue or Wall Street was ever going to believe that those same 10-year-olds and the teenagers and eventual quote-unquote adults retaining the same sensibilities would end up being the new permanent driving force of the disposable income economy heading into the 80s and continuing up through, well, here we are. But the thing about this view of pop culture history vis-a-vis Star Wars is, it's not right.
This bickering is pointless.
In fact, it's overlooking a key piece of what happened here. Star Wars' supposedly out-of-nowhere debut didn't so much represent the birth of the so-called geek culture as part of the pop mainstream so much as it represented the ascendancy of a consumer counterculture that had been steadily building for well over a decade. And since if you're watching this and there's still a planet, you probably already have a sense of what the impact of Star Wars was, and since the whole purpose of this exercise is to constrain ourselves to the original film rather than the franchise that exploded out of it, let us instead turn our attention to what was waiting to be impacted in Ground Zero 1977.
Almost there. I can't hold them!
As we just got done observing, the carefully executed timelessness of George Lucas' acute sense of the mythic ingrained in the original Star Wars makes it easy to forget that it's a relatively recent creation and not actually an ageless legend that's been with us forever, especially now that more and more of its fanbase came of age after it was released than before, and thus literally never knew a world without it. As such, it can be easy, if you don't have a reason to spend a lot of time thinking about such things especially, to lose track of how many different piecemeal elements of the so-called geek media and nerd culture collective experience that somehow feel adjacent to the post-Star Wars blast radius were actually either contemporary or significantly predated the original film, and yet an understanding of this is a vital and often missing component to the culture's overall grasp of how the Star Wars phenomenon came about.
An elegant weapon for a more civilized age.
Now, obviously, Star Wars fans of varying levels of commitment are already aware of previously noted direct acknowledged inspirations. The Flash Gordon serials, the comic strips that inspired them, the pulp adventures of Buck Rogers and John Carter that had in turn inspired those, E. Doc Smith's Lensman, Herc Herbert's Dune, Tolkien, Joseph Campbell, the myriad permutations of Arthurian mythology, Kurosawa's samurai films, and God only knows what other late 70s genre entertainment trends were bopping around inside the scattered imagination of a young filmmaker occasionally considered the weird one in a buddy group that included Brian De Palma and John Milius. But apart from the popular and not so popular genre artifacts that personally informed George Lucas, recall for a moment that the following rundown is just a sampling of things that you might not often think of as having been playing out in the worlds of sci-fi and fantasy fandom before Star Wars, but very much were.
Apes. 20th Century Fox transforms the motion picture screen into Planet of the Apes.
Planet of the Apes. Yes, the very first big studio sci-fi mega-franchise before Star Wars. Obviously, everyone knows the first one came out long before the Lucasfilms did, but remember that the franchise itself kept going with almost yearly sequels up through 1973, a TV show in 74, and an animated series in 75, meaning that this series and the idea of a sprawling multimedia film, television, comic book, and merchandising empire themed around a singular sci-fi continuity was very much part of the public imagination before Star Wars popped on everyone's radar. Star Trek. Well, there's a big one right there. And again, yes, everyone knows the original series had come and gone a decade prior to Star Wars. However, even though the franchise wouldn't reach the big screen until after Star Wars made the big-budget sci-fi thing a profitable endeavor again, as with Planet of the Apes, the popularity of Trek had helped create what was becoming the shared collective experience of the fandom consumer culture. While science fiction and comic book conventions had existed in some form since the mid-50s and early 60s, if not earlier, dedicated Trek conventions came of age in the 70s and helped push the continued ongoing popularity of the franchise through tie-in comics, books, the 1973 animated series, which is actually pretty cool if you've never given it a chance, but that's another show, and similarly themed media chasing the same audience. Robert E. Howard and Conan. This will make sense in a moment. I imagine most people who are aware that Conan the Barbarian was a character in a series of pulp sword and sorcery stories before it was a Schwarzenegger movie also know that said stories are significantly older than Star Wars. Semi-topical sidebar, it also feels weird that Conan is so much older than Lord of the Rings, right? Like, neither of them feel particularly wedded to a time and place, but something about Tolkien always feels authentically ancient, where Howard trends toward perpetual contemporariness, right? Something about the use of language, I imagine. However, what many are less aware of is that, like most pulp authors of his era, Howard had a pretty limited long-term readership in his own era. The Conan stories in particular didn't have significant pop culture renaissance until the high fantasy genre exploded in the mid to late 60s and early 70s, a phenomenon that many attribute to the popularity of new generation fantasy art popularized by Frank Frazetta used to market the new editions of his books, which in turn contributed to a fresh rise in action-heavy storytelling in the fantasy and sci-fi genre in general, and had a major influence on the emergence of Dungeons and Dragons. There is, of course, some dispute as to the actual origin point of Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games like that in particular, but in the terms of the owlbear shit hitting the blade barrier, original D&D hits in 1974, and then TSR puts out the basic set, and then AD&D in 1977, the same year as Star Wars, effectively taking what up to that point may indeed have been the shadowiest of what we now call the geek community's shadowy subcultures, role-playing and wargaming, and blowing it out into one more widely circulated, mass-marketed, and monetized arm of the hobby shop economy, where you may have found it sharing shelf space with Metal Hurlant, or heavy metal, introduced a generation of readers to bold new visions of adult-oriented sci-fi in both art and storytelling starting in 1974, and one would be hard-pressed to imagine a strain of the genre it did not leave its stamp on in some way. And speaking of illustrated fiction, where to even begin? By the time Have You Heard About This Movie Called Star Wars first crept into comic book store conversations, Gwen Stacy had already been killed, meaning the entire Silver Age was effectively over already. That's a big one. Roy Thomas' Kree-Skrull War storyline was 6 years old in 1977. Jim Starling's Captain Marvel and Warlock stories had already happened. The new version of the X-Men had debuted in 1975. In fact, the heavily outer space warfare-centric Phoenix saga was half over by the time Star Wars hit. Sticking with that epics in outer space theme, Jack Kirby's New Gods tenure had come and gone at DC, his decidedly simmer Eternals books were in mid-run at Marvel, as was his 1976 very different adaptation and expansion of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which brought the lore aspect of the Arthur C. Clarke story back into a semi-prominent nerd culture discussion space, where Stanley Kubrick had opted to downplay that aspect in the film. And speaking of film, we've already covered the way Star Wars pushed the space age movies into a new era by marrying A-tier sci-fi special effects to so-called B-tier sci-fi storytelling, but it's important to remember that even though the marked visible shift from the Hollywood standard being something like Logan's Run to Star Wars was Star Wars, some of the machinations were already in place, though yes, who can say if everything would have lined up without it. Silent Running had applied quasi-realism to both used universe and friendly robot concepts. The project that would eventually become Alien had been in development since Dan O'Bannon's collaboration with John Carpenter and Ron Cobb on Dark Star. Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters was of course practically a concurrent production, and over at Warner Brothers, Superman had been in active development since 1973 and in production since 1975, even though it wouldn't release until over a year after Star Wars. And we haven't even mentioned that this was in the initial ascendancy of early video games, which were hitting a milestone that same year and had originated with a heavy sci-fi influence, the first one literally being Space Wars in 1962. Look, this could honestly just keep going, but I imagine the point is made. This swirling melange of cultural influences was effectively the landing strip that had been laid out for Star Wars' approach. It's just that neither the film nor the strip knew anything about one another. For all the attention paid to how immediately Star Wars interfaced with, overwhelmed, and supercharged the realms of underground nerd culture and the youth entertainment scene, ultimately fusing them into a singular media-dominating market force the likes of which the world had never seen before, what's remarkable is how uncynically it arrived there. The studio thought they were buying a laser light show to entertain teenagers for a couple weekends. George Lucas thought he was shrewdly getting a studio to pay him to realize a hodgepodge of his dreams and obsessions in the guise of selling them a laser light show. No one was actually trying to land dead center in the Venn diagram of exactly what popular culture had apparently been looking for at exactly that moment in time. But that's what they did, and after all this, looking back on the whole thing, it's impossible for me to even consider disputing that Star Wars succeeded because it gave popular culture the film that it didn't even know that it wanted. But the question is, was it the film that it needed?
I fear something terrible has happened.